She paid for his college. She bought his first car. She skipped her own doctor appointments so she could send him money every single time he asked. For 46 years, Margaret Callahan gave her oldest son everything she had, every sacrifice, every dollar, every prayer. And when she got sick, when her hands started shaking and she could no longer drive herself to the pharmacy, Ryan didn't answer the phone. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is what Claire found when she finally drove 3 hours to check on her mother. The savings account was empty. The house was almost gone. And there was a document with Margaret's signature, dated just 4 months earlier, that she had absolutely no memory of signing. What happened inside that house will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty. And the ending, I promise you, you will not see it coming. So stay with me. Welcome back to The Moral Pivot, the channel where we don't look away from the stories that are hard to tell, because those are exactly the ones that need to be heard. If this is your first time here, I want you to stop for just 1 second and hit that subscribe button. Every week we bring you real, raw, deeply human stories about loyalty, betrayal, sacrifice, and justice, and you don't want to miss a single one. And if you've been watching for a while, you already know that the comment section on this channel is one of the most honest places on the internet. So let's keep that going. Before we dive in, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments. Every single time I ask this, I'm blown away by how far this community reaches, and it never gets old. Now here's the real question, and I want you to think about this honestly. Do you know someone like Ryan Callahan? Maybe it's not your brother. Maybe it's a cousin, an uncle, a neighbor's kid, someone who took and took and took from the people who loved them most and disappeared the moment things got hard. Because I can tell you, the messages and comments you all send me every week make it very clear this story is not as rare as we would like to believe. And if you've ever been the Claire in your family, the one who was overlooked, underestimated, never the favorite, this one is for you. Because today we're going to talk about what happens when the truth finally catches up. This is the story of Margaret Callahan, her son Ryan, her daughter Claire, and a choice that changed all of their lives forever. Let's begin. To understand how Margaret Callahan ended up alone in that house with nothing left in her bank account, you have to go back. Not to last year, not to the moment Claire found those documents, you have to go back to where it all started. Because this story didn't begin with betrayal. It began with love. With a mother who loved so deeply, so completely, and so unevenly, that she planted the seeds of her own destruction without ever realizing it. Margaret raised 2 children in a white colonial house on Birchwood Lane in Columbus, Ohio. Ryan was born first, and from the very beginning, there was something about him that made Margaret's heart swell in a way she couldn't quite explain. He was bright, charming, and he had his father Daniel's green eyes and confident smile. When he walked into a room, people noticed, and Margaret noticed that people noticed, and she was proud in a way that went bone deep. Claire came along 14 months later, quieter and softer, with her auburn curls and her freckled nose always buried in a book. She was a sweet child, anyone who knew her would tell you that, but she wasn't Ryan. She didn't command attention the way he did. She didn't make Margaret feel like she had produced something extraordinary. And so, without ever saying it out loud, without ever making a conscious decision, Margaret began to pour more of herself into Ryan. A little more patience here. A little more praise there. A little more money when it was tight. And it was almost always tight. Daniel Callahan died of a heart attack when Ryan was 19 and Claire was 18. It was sudden, devastating. and it left Margaret completely alone with 2 kids on the edge of adulthood and a life insurance policy that was enough to breathe but not enough to be comfortable. Ryan was about to start college at Ohio State, and Margaret made a decision without hesitation she would pay for every cent of it. Claire, she gently suggested, might want to consider community college for the first 2 years. It would be more practical, more affordable. Claire nodded and said nothing, because that was what Claire always did. Ryan graduated with a law degree 6 years later and landed a position at a firm in Chicago. Then, whenever he remembered, which was less and less often as the years went by and his life in Chicago grew bigger and more polished and further away from Birchwood Lane, Claire, meanwhile, stayed close. She finished her degree at a state school, paying for it herself through loans and weekend shifts at a diner on Route 40. She became a 3rd-grade teacher in a town called Maplewood, about 3 hours from Columbus, and she built a quiet, honest life for herself. She called her mother twice a week. She drove back for every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday. She was never thanked for it the way Ryan was thanked, just for showing up once a year with a bottle of expensive wine and a blazer that cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery bill. But Claire kept showing up anyway, because that was who she was. By the time Margaret turned 68, her health had begun to shift in small but troubling ways. Her hands shook slightly in the mornings. She forgot words mid-sentence sometimes, standing in the kitchen with a look of quiet frustration on her face, reaching for something that wouldn't come. She didn't tell Ryan because she didn't want to worry him. She told Claire, who immediately started researching neurologists in Columbus and offered to come stay for a few weeks. Margaret told her not to fuss. Everything was fine. And because Margaret had spent a lifetime minimizing her own pain, she almost believed it herself. Then Ryan called, not on a Sunday, not on a birthday out of nowhere on a Tuesday afternoon in March. His voice was warm and familiar, and he said he'd been thinking about her a lot lately and that he and Victoria were planning to come visit that weekend. Margaret hung up the phone and stood in her yellow-tiled kitchen with her hand on her chest, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt chosen. She had no idea that phone call was the beginning of the end. Ryan and Victoria arrived on a Saturday morning in a black Mercedes that looked completely out of place, parked in front of the old, white colonial house on Birchwood Lane. Margaret had been up since 6, cleaning things that were already clean, arranging flowers she had cut from her own garden, and making a pot roast because that was what she always made when Ryan came home. Harold Bennett, her neighbor, watched from his front porch as the couple stepped out of the car. He noticed immediately that neither of them looked up at the house with any warmth. Victoria glanced at the peeling paint on the front window frames and said something to Ryan that Harold couldn't hear, but he could see her expression clearly enough. It was the look of someone calculating the value of something they didn't yet own. Margaret opened the door before they even knocked. She was wearing her best floral blouse and her pearl necklace, and when Ryan pulled her into a hug, she closed her eyes and held on for a moment longer than he expected. Victoria air-kissed her on both cheeks and handed her a bouquet of white lilies, beautiful flowers. Cold flowers, the kind you bring to a funeral, and swept past her into the living room. Already looking around with those pale blue eyes moving slowly from wall to wall, corner to corner. Margaret didn't notice. She only had eyes for her son. Lunch was warm and surface level, pleasant. Ryan told stories about a big case he had won, about a trip he and Victoria had taken to Portugal, about a restaurant in Chicago that had a 3-month waiting list. Margaret laughed and asked questions and refilled his glass before he even had to ask. Victoria picked at her food and scrolled through her phone under the table when she thought Margaret wasn't looking. And then, somewhere between the second helping of mashed potatoes and the apple pie Margaret had baked from scratch that morning, Ryan set down his fork, folded his hands on the table, and said he wanted to talk about something important. He called it getting organized. That was the phrase he used, calm, professional, the voice he probably used with clients who didn't yet realize what they were agreeing to. He told Margaret that he had been thinking about her future, about making sure everything was in order in case something happened. He mentioned the house, the savings account, the small investment portfolio Daniel had left behind. He said that as an attorney, he knew better than most how complicated things could get when families weren't prepared. He said he just wanted to protect her. He said it with those green eyes, steady and sincere, and Margaret sat across from him, nodding slowly, feeling grateful that her son was finally paying attention. What Ryan proposed, over the next hour, was a plan to transfer power of attorney to himself, meaning he would have the legal authority to make financial decisions on Margaret's behalf. He framed it as a safety net, something that would only ever be used if she became incapacitated. He had brought the documents already, printed and tabbed. Sitting in a neat leather folder he pulled from his briefcase as if this had always been part of the plan for the afternoon. Margaret looked at the papers and then looked at her son, and she did what she had been doing her entire life. She trusted him completely and without question, because he was Ryan, and Ryan had always been the smart one. She signed without reading, not because she was reckless, but because she was a mother looking at her child and seeing only the best version of him, the one she had always believed in, the one she had sacrificed everything to build. Ryan gathered the documents, slid them back into the leather folder, and clicked it shut with a quiet finality that should have felt like a door closing. Instead, Margaret felt relief. She felt taken care of. Victoria, sitting silently at the end of the table, reached for her wine glass and allowed herself a very small, very slow smile that disappeared before anyone could register it was ever there. That evening, Harold saw Ryan loading a box into the trunk of the Mercedes before dinner was even finished. He couldn't see what was inside. He told himself it was probably nothing, maybe old things Ryan had stored there years ago, maybe something Margaret had asked him to take. But Harold had known Margaret for 30 years, and he had known the kind of man Daniel Callahan was, and something about the weight of that box and the casual way Ryan carried it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He almost walked over. He almost said something. Instead, he went inside, made himself a cup of coffee, and stood at his kitchen window watching the black Mercedes back out of the driveway and disappeared down Birchwood Lane. Ryan and Victoria did not stay the night. They had a dinner reservation in Columbus, Ryan explained, kissing his mother on the forehead and telling her he would call soon. Margaret stood on her porch in the cool March air and waved until the car was completely out of sight. Then she went back inside, looked at the leftover pot roast on the stove, and felt the house grow quiet around her in that particular way it always did after Ryan left. Like the air itself had shifted back to its default setting, and the warmth had gone with him. She washed the dishes, put on the television, and went to bed feeling happier than she had in months. She had no idea she had just signed away everything. The calls stopped in April. Not all at once, Ryan was too calculated for that. At first it was a missed Sunday here, a short voicemail there, a text message instead of a real conversation. Margaret made excuses for him the way she always had. He was busy with a big case. Victoria had family visiting. Chicago was exhausting in the spring. She told herself these things while sitting at her kitchen table with her phone face up in front of her, waiting for it to light up with his name. Harold could see her through the window sometimes, just sitting there, still as furniture, in that yellow-tiled kitchen, and it bothered him more than he knew how to say. By May, Margaret's health had taken a quiet but undeniable turn. The tremors in her hands had gotten worse, spreading from the mornings into the afternoons, and she had started losing track of small things: where she put her keys, whether she had taken her medication, what day of the week it was. She called her own doctor's office twice to schedule an appointment and forgot both times to follow through. She was not incompetent. She was not helpless. But she was a 71-year-old woman living alone in a house that had become too large and too quiet, and she was beginning to slip in ways that frightened her when she was honest with herself, which she tried very hard not to be. Claire noticed during a phone call in the middle of May. It wasn't one dramatic moment, it was a collection of small things that added up to something that made Claire's stomach drop. Her mother repeated the same story about Harold's garden twice in the same conversation without realizing it. She referred to something Ryan had told her last week that Claire knew had actually happened months ago. And at one point, mid-sentence, Margaret went completely silent for nearly 8 seconds, not a pause, not a search for words, but a full blank stop before continuing as if nothing had happened. Claire hung up the phone and sat in her car in the school parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do. She called Ryan that same evening. He answered on the 3rd ring, which already felt like a small miracle. Claire told him, carefully and without accusation, that she was worried about their mother, that something seemed off, that she thought someone should check in on her in person, that maybe it was time to talk about getting some help at the house. Ryan listened. She could hear the smooth, practiced patience in his silence. And then he told her she was overreacting. He said Margaret was sharp as a tack, that he had just spoken with her, though he couldn't name when exactly, and that Claire had always had a tendency to catastrophize. He said it gently, the way he said everything, but the message underneath was clear. Stay in your lane, Claire. This is handled. What Claire didn't know, what she had no way of knowing yet, was that Ryan had already begun moving. In the weeks following the March visit, using the power of attorney Margaret had signed without fully understanding, he had quietly redirected the automatic deposits from Margaret's small investment portfolio into a separate account in his name. It was done incrementally, in amounts small enough not to trigger immediate flags, over the course of several weeks. Victoria had researched the process carefully, and Ryan had executed it with the calm precision of a man who had spent his career finding legal seams that other people couldn't see. From the outside, everything looked like responsible estate management. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Margaret spent most of June alone. She tended to her rose bushes every morning, moving slowly along the garden fence with her watering can, stopping sometimes to rest her hands on the wooden post and look out at the quiet street. Harold made a habit of being on his porch when she was outside, not to interfere, just to be present. They would exchange a few words about the weather, about the roses, about nothing in particular, and in those small conversations, Harold began to notice that Margaret never mentioned money. She never mentioned the bills. And he noticed one afternoon in late June, when she left her front door open while she carried in groceries, that the house felt different inside, less full, like things had been removed and the spaces hadn't adjusted yet to their own emptiness. In July, Margaret went to her mailbox and found a notice from her bank. She stood on the front path in her floral blouse and read it twice, then a third time, with her reading glasses pushed up her nose and the morning sun in her eyes. The letter informed her that her savings account balance had fallen below the minimum threshold and that a maintenance fee had been applied. Margaret's savings account, which had held just over $41,000 in March, now showed a balance of less than 3,000. She stood there on that path for a long time, holding the letter in both hands, trying to understand what she was looking at. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the pocket of her blouse, went inside, and sat down at the kitchen table. She did not call Ryan, she did not call Claire. She sat in complete silence, with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and for the first time in her life she was afraid of her own home. It was Harold who finally made the call. He hadn't planned to get involved. He had told himself a dozen times that it wasn't his place, that families had their own way of working things out, that Margaret was a grown woman who could ask for help if she needed it. But on a Wednesday evening in late July, he looked through the window and saw her sitting in the kitchen in the dark, the lights off, the television silent, completely still. He went home, found the piece of paper where he had written Claire's number years ago after Daniel's funeral, just in case. He had told himself then, and he dialed it with a steadiness that surprised him. Claire answered on the second ring. Harold took a breath and said, simply and without drama, that she needed to come home, that something was wrong, and that she needed to come soon. Claire left Maplewood at 5:30 in the morning on a Thursday, before the sun had fully decided to rise. She drove the 3 hours to Columbus, with her hands tight on the wheel and the radio off, running through every possible explanation in her head, trying to find the version of events that would make Harold's call something other than what her gut told her it was. She had packed a bag for a week, not knowing exactly why, just knowing that whatever she was driving toward was not something she would be able to fix in an afternoon and leave behind. She stopped once for gas and coffee, and when she got back in the car, she sat for a moment with the cup warming her hands, looking out at the flat Ohio highway stretching ahead of her, and she let herself feel the thing she had been pushing down for months. She was terrified. The house on Birchwood Lane looked the same from the outside: white siding, blue window frames, the rose bushes along the front fence still holding their color despite the August heat. But when Margaret opened the door, Claire felt the air go out of her chest. Her mother had lost weight. Not dramatically, not the kind of weight loss that announces itself, but the quiet, gradual kind that happens when someone stops cooking real meals, stops sitting down to eat, stops taking care of themselves in the small daily ways that add up to health. Her pearl necklace sat loose around her neck, her floral blouse hung off one shoulder, and her eyes, those warm, light brown eyes, had a film over them that Claire had never seen before, not sadness exactly, but a kind of retreat, like something behind them had stepped back from the window. Claire hugged her mother for a long time in the doorway, and Margaret let herself be held in a way she normally wouldn't, without pulling back, without saying she was fine, without deflecting into practicality. That alone told Claire everything. She brought her bag inside, made them both tea, and sat across the kitchen table the way she had sat 1,000 times before in that yellow-tiled room. And then, gently, the way you approach something fragile, she started asking questions. About the mail, about the bills, about the bank. Margaret answered slowly, choosing her words with visible effort. And partway through, she got up and went to the drawer by the refrigerator and pulled out a folded piece of paper that she set on the table between them without a word. It was the bank notice from July. Claire read it, set it down, and read it again. She spent the rest of that morning going through the house systematically, with Margaret sitting at the table, watching her and Harold standing in the doorway that connected the kitchen to the back porch, because Claire had called him on the way in and asked him to be there. What she found over the following 2 hours was a picture assembled from fragments bank statements that showed regular withdrawals beginning in April, a missing folder from the filing cabinet in the study where Margaret kept her financial documents, and a copy of a power of attorney agreement that Claire found tucked inside a cookbook on the kitchen shelf, as if someone had put it somewhere Margaret would be unlikely to look, but unlikely to throw away. Claire read the document, standing at the kitchen counter, and by the time she reached the bottom of the second page, her hands were completely steady in the particular way that hands go steady when anger replaces fear. The power of attorney was airtight. Ryan had made sure of that. It was properly notarized, correctly formatted, and Margaret's signature was at the bottom of every page, clear and undeniable. But there was something else in that folder, a single sheet of paper that Ryan had apparently overlooked or decided didn't matter. It was a printed email exchange between Ryan and Victoria from February, weeks before the March visit, in which Victoria had written, with complete casualness, that they needed to move before the old woman's condition got bad enough that a court might question her capacity to sign. Ryan had replied with a single line, "I'll handle it when we go in March." Claire photographed every page with her phone, then set the folder on the table in front of Harold and watched his face as he read it. He took off his wireframe glasses, rubbed his eyes, put them back on, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, that Ryan had always reminded him of a certain kind of man, the kind that made you feel like you were being taken care of, right up, until the moment you realized you were being taken apart. That evening, Claire called Ryan from the back porch, standing in the garden among her mother's roses, with the August air thick and still around her. She had decided on the drive down from Maplewood that if she found something wrong, she would confront him directly before doing anything else, not out of loyalty, but because she needed to hear what he would say. Ryan answered after 4 rings, his voice easy and unbothered, and when Claire told him she was at the house and that she had been going through the finances, there was a pause, brief, controlled, but real, before he reassembled himself. He told her she had no business going through their mother's private documents. He told her Margaret had asked him to help manage things because she was struggling, which was true in the way that only the outermost surface of a thing can be true. He told her the money had been moved for tax purposes and that a lawyer himself was overseeing everything legally and responsibly. He said all of this without raising his voice, without a single crack in his composure, and Claire stood there in the rose garden listening to her brother construct a perfectly smooth wall out of words, and realized that arguing with him on the phone was exactly what he wanted, because it kept her talking instead of moving. She called a family attorney the next morning, not a friend of Ryan's, not someone from Columbus, but a woman named Patricia Odom in Maplewood who specialized in elder financial abuse cases and who Claire had found at 11 o'clock the night before while sitting on the edge of the guest bed with her laptop open and the house silent around her. Patricia listened to everything Claire described, asked 3 precise and unsentimental questions, and told her to bring every document she had photographed, the original power of attorney, and the printed email exchange to her office as soon as possible. She also told Claire something that made the whole room feel different, that an improperly obtained power of attorney, particularly one signed by an individual showing documented signs of cognitive decline at the time of signing, could be legally challenged and potentially voided. Claire wrote that down on the back of a grocery receipt that was sitting on the nightstand. She underlined the word voided twice. The hardest part of that entire day, harder than the documents, harder than Ryan's phone call, harder than watching her mother try to remember the exact sequence of events from March, was sitting across the kitchen table that evening and telling Margaret the truth. Not a softened version of it, not a carefully edited summary designed to protect her feelings, but the full weight of what Claire had found and what she believed it meant. Margaret listened without interrupting. Her hands were flat on the table, perfectly still, and her light brown eyes stayed fixed on Claire's face throughout. When Claire finished, Margaret was quiet for a very long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a car passed slowly down Birchwood Lane, and then Margaret reached across the table and put both of her hands over Claire's. And in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "I think I've known for a while. I just didn't want it to be true." And those 11 words broke something open in that kitchen that neither of them would ever fully be able to put back together. Patricia Odom's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Elm Street in Maplewood. Small and deliberately unintimidating, with plants on the windowsill and law books arranged on shelves that went from floor to ceiling. Claire sat across from her on a Tuesday morning with a manila envelope containing every photograph, every document, and the original printed email exchange between Ryan and Victoria. Patricia read through everything without rushing, occasionally making a small note in the margin of her legal pad, her expression steady and professional throughout. When she finished, she set the papers down, folded her hands, and told Claire directly that what she was looking at constituted a textbook case of elder financial abuse, and that the email exchange was not just damaging to Ryan's position, it was the kind of evidence that made cases like this significantly easier to prosecute. Claire exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. The legal process began moving faster than Claire had expected, and slower than she could emotionally tolerate. Patricia filed an emergency petition to have the power of attorney reviewed and suspended pending investigation, citing Margaret's documented cognitive symptoms and the evidence of financial manipulation. A court-appointed evaluator visited the house on Birchwood Lane the following week, a quiet woman in her 50s who sat with Margaret for nearly 2 hours, asking questions, showing her cards, walking her through simple memory exercises with a patience that made Harold, watching from the kitchen doorway, have to look away. The evaluator's report, filed 4 days later, noted that while Margaret Callahan showed early signs of age-related cognitive impairment, she retained sufficient understanding of her own affairs to have been entitled to full explanation and independent legal counsel before signing any document transferring financial authority. She had received neither. Ryan hired a defense attorney within 48 hours of being formally notified of the petition, a man named Gerald Marsh from a firm in Chicago, expensive and experienced, who sent a 12-page letter to Patricia Odom's office arguing that Ryan had acted entirely within legal boundaries, that the power of attorney had been freely and knowingly signed, and that Claire's involvement represented an emotionally motivated interference in a legitimate estate planning process. Claire read the letter at Patricia's desk and felt her jaw tighten with every paragraph. Patricia told her not to worry about Gerald Marsh. She had seen his arguments before. She said, and they tended to fall apart in the presence of a printed email in which the client's own wife had written the words before the old woman's condition got bad enough. Gerald Marsh's 12 pages, Patricia said calmly, could not outlast those 23 words. What Ryan had not anticipated, what neither he nor Victoria had apparently considered in their careful, incremental planning, was Harold Bennett. When Patricia's investigator contacted Harold as a potential witness, he came to the meeting with a worn leather notebook that he had been keeping, almost without realizing why, since the afternoon of Ryan and Victoria's March visit. Harold had always been a methodical man, the kind who wrote things down out of habit rather than intention, and what he had recorded over the months that followed was a quiet but devastating timeline dates. Observations, specific details about what he had seen and heard from his porch and through his kitchen window. The box Ryan had loaded into the Mercedes. The lights off in Margaret's kitchen in the dark. The bank notice she had been standing, reading, in the front path, her hands trembling on a morning in July. Harold's notebook was 41 pages long. Patricia called it the single most useful piece of evidence she had encountered in 14 years of elder abuse law. Ryan flew back to Columbus in September, not voluntarily, but because the court required his presence at a preliminary hearing. Claire saw him for the first time since the March visit in the hallway outside the courtroom, and the thing that struck her most was how little he had changed on the surface. Same dark suit, same steady green eyes, same controlled posture that made him look like a man who had never once in his life been caught off guard. He looked at her across that hallway with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite contempt. It was something more specific than either of those things. The look of a person who had always privately believed that the rules applied to other people, and was only now beginning to absorb the fact that they did not. Victoria was not with him. She had, according to Ryan's attorney, remained in Chicago on the advice of counsel. The hearing itself lasted less than 3 hours. The judge, a deliberate woman named the Honorable Sandra Pruitt, who had been on the family court bench in Columbus for 17 years, reviewed the evidence with a thoroughness that made Gerald Marsh visibly uncomfortable in his expensive suit. When she reached the printed email exchange, she paused for long enough that the courtroom went completely still. She asked Ryan's attorney to confirm, for the record, that the email was authentic and had not been disputed. Gerald Marsh confirmed it. Judge Pruitt set the papers down, looked over her glasses at both tables, and announced that the power of attorney signed by Margaret Callahan on March 14th was hereby suspended pending full investigation, and that all accounts accessed under its authority were to be frozen immediately. Ryan sat perfectly still when she said it, but Claire, watching him from across the room, saw his jaw tighten for just a fraction of a second, and in that fraction of a second, the composure he had carried his entire life showed its first visible crack. The financial investigation took 11 weeks. What it uncovered, when fully reconstructed by the court-appointed forensic accountant, was that Ryan had transferred a total of $38,420 from Margaret's accounts between April and July, money moved in careful increments, routed through to intermediary accounts, most of it already spent on renovations to the Chicago apartment he and Victoria shared. The investment portfolio had been partially liquidated. A lien had been quietly placed on the Birchwood Lane property that, left unchallenged, would have allowed Ryan to claim a significant portion of the house's value upon its eventual sale. Patricia presented the full accounting to Claire on a Wednesday afternoon in November, sliding the summary sheet across the desk with the kind of quiet precision that made the numbers feel even heavier than they already were. Claire looked at the total for a long time without speaking. Then she asked how much of it could be recovered. Patricia told her that with the accounts frozen and the lien challenged, they were looking at recovering most of it, not all, but most. Claire nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was an answer she could work with. On the last Friday of November, Ryan Callahan was formally charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult under Ohio state law, a felony charge that carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years. He stood in that courtroom in the same dark suit, with Gerald Marsh beside him, and entered a plea of not guilty in the same steady voice he used for everything. But something had shifted in him in a way that was visible if you knew what to look for. The confidence was still there, but it was performance now rather than certainty, the difference between a man who believes he is untouchable and a man who is working very hard to look like he still does. Claire was not in the courtroom for the arraignment. She was on Birchwood Lane, sitting at her mother's kitchen table in the yellow-tiled room where this story had really begun, drinking tea and watching the November frost settle over Margaret's rose bushes through the window. Margaret sat across from her, her pearl necklace resting at her collarbone, her hands wrapped round her mug. They didn't talk about Ryan. They talked about Christmas, about whether the roses would survive the winter, about a third-grade student of Claire's who had apparently decided that frogs made acceptable classroom pets, and for the first time in as long as either of them could remember, the house on Birchwood Lane felt exactly the right size. Margaret Callahan never fully recovered the $41,000 that Ryan had spent. The courts ordered restitution, but money that has already been poured into marble countertops and designer furniture in a Chicago apartment does not come back clean or complete. What was recovered, just over $26,000, was returned to her account by the following spring, enough to stabilize the house on Birchwood Lane and cover the medical care she had been quietly going without for the better part of a year. The lien on the property was removed. The investment portfolio, what remained of it, was placed under a legitimate financial guardianship arranged by Patricia Odom, with Claire designated as the sole authorized contact. Margaret's name was taken off every document that Ryan had touched, one by one, until there was nothing left of his signature on her life. Ryan's criminal case moved through the Ohio court system over the following 18 months. Gerald Marsh was skilled and relentless, and he managed to negotiate the felony charge down to a misdemeanor count of financial misconduct in exchange for full restitution, a 5-year probationary period, and the permanent surrender of Ryan's Ohio law license. He retained his Illinois license under a separate agreement, though the Chicago firm had quietly asked him to resign 4 days after his name appeared in a Columbus legal trade publication in connection with the investigation. Victoria filed for divorce 3 months after the arraignment. She did it through her own attorney, efficiently and without drama, the way she did everything, and she was gone from Ryan's life with the same calculated speed with which she had entered it. Ryan moved into a smaller apartment on the north side of Chicago. He did not contact Margaret. He did not contact Claire. The Sunday calls, which had stopped years ago anyway, did not resume. Harold Bennett became, in the months that followed, something that resisted a simple label. He was not family, technically. He was not a professional caretaker or a legal guardian or any of the official things that get written on forms. He was a 74-year-old man in khaki pants and a plaid flannel shirt who had known Margaret Callahan for 30 years, who had been friends with her husband, and who had kept a leather notebook out of nothing more than habit and a quiet, stubborn refusal to look away from something that felt wrong. He started driving Margaret to her medical appointments in September, just until Claire could find someone closer, he said, and was still driving her to them the following June. Margaret started leaving a plate of food on his porch on Sunday afternoons. Harold started leaving tomatoes from his garden on hers on Tuesday mornings. Neither of them ever formally acknowledged that this had become a rhythm, because some things are more solid when they are not named. Claire requested a leave of absence from her teaching position in January and spent 3 months in Columbus helping Margaret through the final stages of the legal process and the beginning stages of a proper medical plan for her cognitive symptoms. The neurologist, she found a careful, unhurried woman who spent 45 minutes with Margaret on the first appointment, and did not once make her feel like a case number confirmed. Early-stage vascular dementia, and outlined a management plan that was realistic without being hopeless. Margaret listened to the diagnosis, sitting upright in the examination chair, with her pearl necklace at her throat and her hands folded in her lap. And when the doctor finished, she asked 2 precise questions about medication and 1 question about whether she would still be able to tend her rose garden. The doctor told her, with complete honesty, that for the foreseeable future, there was no reason she couldn't. Margaret nodded once, as if filing the information away in the appropriate place, and said, "Then let's get started." Claire went back to Maplewood in April, to her classroom and her students and the quiet life she had built there without anyone's help or acknowledgement. But she drove to Columbus every third weekend, and she called every Tuesday and Thursday evening, and she sent Margaret photographs of her students' artwork in the mail because Margaret had said once, offhandedly, that she liked getting actual letters rather than texts. The relationship between them had shifted in a way that was hard to put into words, not repaired exactly, because repair implies returning to what something was before. And what they had before was built on an imbalance that neither of them had fully admitted. What they had now was something new, more honest, more equal, built on the specific kind of closeness that only comes from having stood together in a very dark room and found a way out. On a Saturday morning in early May, Margaret walked out to her front garden with her watering can and found that the rose bushes had survived the winter. All of them, every single one, the pale pink climbers along the left fence, the deep red hybrid teas her mother had planted in the 60s, the small white ramblers that Daniel had brought home one anniversary as a surprise and that Margaret had almost lost twice in particularly brutal Ohio winters. They were all there, leafing out slowly in the May sun, unbothered by everything that had happened inside the house behind them. Harold was on his porch with his coffee, as he almost always was, and he raised his mug when he saw her. Margaret looked at her roses for a long time, one hand resting on the fence post, the morning light soft and unhurried around her. Then she picked up her watering can and got to work. And that is where we leave Margaret Callahan, not in a courtroom, not in a hospital, not in the dark of her kitchen, alone with a bank notice she doesn't understand. We leave her in her garden on a May morning, taking care of what is hers. Because that is what survival actually looks like most of the time. Not dramatic, not loud, just someone deciding, quietly and without an audience, to keep going. This story is not as rare as it should be. Financial abuse of elderly parents by adult children is one of the most underreported forms of elder abuse in the United States, and the reason it goes unreported so often is exactly what we saw in Margaret's story. Because it doesn't come from strangers, it comes from the people we trust the most, from the ones we spent our lives loving without conditions, and that makes it almost impossible to name, let alone to fight. If this story made you feel something, anger, recognition, grief, relief, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Tell me which moment hit hardest. Tell me if you've seen something like this in your own family, in your neighborhood, in your life, because I promise you, this community listens. And sometimes just writing it down in a comment section is the first step towards something important. And before you go, if you are not yet subscribed to the Moral Pivot, right now is the moment. Hit that button, because next week we have a story coming that I genuinely could not believe was real when I first heard it, and I do not want you to miss it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Send it to the Claire in your life. Send it to someone who is still waiting for their Ryan to call on a Sunday. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching until the end. And I will see you in the next one.